Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. I, 32F, have been a people pleaser my entire life, often to my own detriment. I've been working in digital marketing for over a decade now. Throughout my career, I've encountered bosses ranging from exceptional to mediocre to downright terrible. One in particular stands out as the worst of them all. This story takes place about 3 years ago. Rebecca, mid-40s, not her real name, was the VP of digital marketing and e-commerce for a medium-sized tech startup. She joined the company about 2 years after I did. Word around the office was that she was the fourth choice for the position and was hired mainly to appease investors who were pushing for more female representation in leadership roles. I worked as a manager under Rebecca, and my responsibilities were extensive. I oversaw the company's website and app content, managed all digital advertising campaigns, handled the department's budget, project managed all our initiatives, created data-driven reports on our digital performance, and developed presentations for future projects. In essence, I did most of Rebecca's work along with all the administrative tasks necessary to keep the department running smoothly. I managed all this because I had access to her email and often sent messages on her behalf to ensure the department functioned effectively. Rebecca's typical day involved strolling in after 10 a.m., taking extended business lunches, and organizing unnecessary company events, which I ended up planning anyway. One day I confronted her about the excessive spending on these events. "Rebecca, don't you think we're stretching our budget too thin with all these parties?" I asked cautiously. She waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it, Sarah. Just borrow from next month's budget to cover any overages. It's all about keeping morale high." So, at the beginning of each month, I'd start with our original budget, and by month's end, I'd have to submit a revised version, edited under Rebecca's direction, that made it appear as if our spending was under control. This detail becomes important later. Juggling so many tasks inevitably led to occasional mistakes on my part. I found myself working 12-hour days, split between office hours and late nights after putting my kids to bed. Weekends weren't much different, with work encroaching on family time. During Rebecca's first major product launch season, our performance was abysmal. She kept changing her mind about the website design, bringing in new marketing agencies run by her friends, and ignoring our product team's carefully planned promotions in favor of her own brilliant ideas. Around this time, I had been battling a persistent infection that eventually led to sepsis, landing me in the hospital. The doctors and my husband attributed it to work-related stress and insisted I needed a break. As I recovered, I realized how much I was sacrificing, my health, my family, and even the company's well-being. But old habits die hard, and I couldn't resist checking my work emails from my hospital bed. What I discovered made my blood boil. First, I noticed a lovely bouquet of flowers from upper management wishing me a speedy recovery. I knew Rebecca had organized the delivery. They were her favorite flowers, after all. I went to her inbox to file the receipt for accounting when I returned. What caught my eye were several emails from the past few days that were clearly not work-related. In these messages, Rebecca was complaining to her personal friends about how I couldn't just get over sepsis and return to work. She also grumbled about being unable to locate any of my notes, spreadsheets, or documents for the projects she was supposed to be managing. They were all on our shared drive, clearly labeled. The most alarming email was to a friend from her previous company, seeking advice on how to boost sales and save her job. In this lengthy exchange, her old colleague asked if anyone was managing most of the work, to which Rebecca mentioned me. The colleague suggested that my mismanagement could be blamed if sales didn't improve by the end of the season. Rebecca mentioned my hospitalization and repeated her earlier complaints. Her friend advised that she couldn't fire me outright as it might appear retaliatory due to my medical leave. However, he suggested that if Rebecca could prove I was embezzling or misusing company resources, she'd have grounds for termination and a convenient scapegoat. Upon my return to work, Rebecca called me into her office. "Sarah, I'm worried you're taking on too much," she said with feigned concern. "I want to lighten your workload." She announced she'd be taking over management of the department budget. "Just drop off this small stack of invoices to accounting," she instructed. "And under no circumstances are you to discuss budgets with them. If you have any concerns about your workload or the department, come directly to me, not HR. Understood?" I nodded, seeing right through her act. Crystal clear, Rebecca, I replied, my tone neutral. Fortunately for me, I had built a strong relationship with Emma, early 50s, our head accountant. Emma had always assured me she'd have my back if I ever needed help. With this in mind, I gathered the stack of invoices from Rebecca's desk to deliver to accounting. I also included the email threads I'd read while in the hospital, the current unedited budget that Rebecca hadn't yet tampered with, and hard copies of old budgets with Rebecca's handwritten instructions on how to adjust the numbers. As a final touch, I added an email from our first round of budget adjustments where Rebecca had subtly threatened to replace me if I couldn't comply with her requests. I walked to accounting and bumped into Emma as planned. She brought up the invoices and I firmly stated, "Rebecca has instructed that she's the only one in our department allowed to discuss budgets and invoices with you." Emma noticed the suspiciously thick folder on her desk, gave me a knowing nod, and ushered me out of her office with a sympathetic smile. Within a week, Rebecca was fired. I later heard that she had been job hopping for the past few years, unable to maintain a stable position. The CEO and HR called me in to personally apologize for everything I had endured and offered me a paid 1-week vacation to be taken at my discretion. Given other ongoing issues with the company, I decided to leave after another year. Fast forward to today. I'm once again a manager for digital marketing and e-commerce. My current boss, Alex, mid-40s M, is fantastic. He trusts my business decisions and supports me in almost everything. We're in the process of hiring my team, which I'll be solely responsible for managing and directing. Today, as I was reviewing applicants, I stumbled upon Rebecca's resume among dozens of others. I stared at her name, wondering how many people shared it. Upon closer inspection, I confirmed it was indeed her. She had clearly fallen down the corporate ladder, with her VP role at our old company being the highest position she'd ever held. Unsurprisingly, she had embellished her achievements, claiming my work as her own and boasting about generating a 95% increase in digital engagement during the product launch at our previous company. As a lifelong people pleaser who firmly believes in second chances, I've never felt more satisfied than when I clicked the disqualified button on her application. The next one is an entitled people story. It was just another ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just gotten home from my job at the local hardware store, kicked off my shoes, and was looking forward to a quiet night in. Little did I know, my world was about to be turned upside down. I had barely sat down on my couch when I heard an aggressive pounding on my front door. Before I could even get up to answer, the door burst open with a loud crack. Suddenly, my small apartment was swarming with police officers, their guns drawn and pointed directly at me. "Freeze! Don't move!" one of them shouted. I was stunned. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could possibly be happening. Had they gotten the wrong apartment? Was this some kind of sick joke? "Get on the ground, now!" another officer yelled. Still in shock, I slowly lowered myself to the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to speak, to ask what was going on, but my words were cut short as an officer roughly handcuffed me. "What's happening? Why are you here?" I managed to stammer out. No answer. Instead, the officers began tearing through my apartment, opening drawers, emptying my closet, and rifling through my personal belongings. I watched helplessly from the floor as they ransacked my home. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 15 minutes, I was yanked to my feet and escorted out of my apartment. As we walked down the hallway, I noticed my neighbors peeking out from behind their doors, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. I was shoved into the back of a police car, still with no explanation of what was going on. The drive to the police station was a blur of confusion and fear. When we arrived, I was led to an interrogation room and left alone for what seemed like hours. Finally, a detective walked in. He introduced himself as Detective Johnson and sat across from me, a thick file in his hands. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "do you know why you're here?" I shook my head, still bewildered by the whole situation. "We received an anonymous tip that you were running a drug operation out of your apartment," he stated matter-of-factly. My jaw dropped. "What? That's ridiculous. I don't have anything to do with drugs." Detective Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Then how do you explain the large amounts of cash and suspicious packages we found in your apartment?" I felt like I was in some kind of bizarre dream. "Cash? Packages? I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a regular guy who works at a hardware store. This has to be some kind of mistake." The detective leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Well, Mr. Thompson, we'll see about that. In the meantime, You'll be staying here while we process the evidence." With that, he left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I spent the night in a holding cell, still trying to wrap my head around what was happening. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to become clear. I was brought back to the interrogation room, where Detective Johnson was waiting for me. This time, his demeanor was different, less accusatory, more apologetic. "Mr. Thompson, it appears there's been a misunderstanding," he began. "We've discovered that the anonymous tip we received was false. It seems you were the victim of a malicious prank." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by anger. "A prank? You invaded my home, detained me overnight, and ransacked my apartment because of a prank?" Detective Johnson had the decency to look embarrassed. "We take all tips about potential drug operations very seriously. We had to act quickly to prevent any evidence from being destroyed. I apologize for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" I sputtered. "This is more than an inconvenience. What about my apartment, my belongings?" "Your apartment has been secured, and you're free to return home now," he replied. "As for your belongings, everything should be as we found it." But when I finally got back to my apartment, I realized that wasn't the case at all. My place was a disaster. Clothes strewn everywhere, furniture overturned, and worst of all, my laptop and several other electronics were missing. I immediately called the police station, demanding to speak with Detective Johnson. When I finally got him on the phone, I explained the situation. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Thompson," he said, sounding genuinely concerned. "I'll send someone over right away to take an inventory of what's missing." True to his word, another officer arrived within the hour. As we went through my apartment, cataloging the damage and missing items, I couldn't help but feel violated all over again. "Do you have any idea who might have called in that false tip?" I asked the officer. He shook his head. "Anonymous tips are hard to trace, but given the nature of this situation, we'll definitely be looking into it." Over the next few days, as I tried to put my life back together, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random prank. It felt targeted, personal. That's when I remembered the argument I'd had with my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, just a week before. She'd complained about noise coming from my apartment, insisting that I was having wild parties every night. I tried to explain that I worked early mornings and was usually in bed by 10 p.m., but she wouldn't listen. Our argument had escalated, ending with her threatening to make me sorry. Could she have been behind this? It seemed far-fetched, but I couldn't shake the suspicion. I decided to do some investigating of my own. I started by talking to other neighbors, asking if they'd noticed anything strange lately. To my surprise, several of them mentioned seeing Mrs. Wilkins talking to a group of shady-looking men in the parking lot the day before the police raid. Armed with this information, I went back to Detective Johnson. At first, he was skeptical, but as I laid out the evidence, the argument, the threats, the witnesses, he began to take me seriously. "All right, Mr. Thompson," he said finally. "We'll look into Mrs. Wilkins. In the meantime, I want you to know that we're taking your case very seriously. We've already initiated an internal investigation into how this situation was handled." Over the next few weeks, things started to come together. The police investigation revealed that Mrs. Wilkins had indeed been behind the false tip. It turned out she had a history of making false reports and harassing her neighbors. The shady men witnesses had seen her talking to were actually small-time criminals she'd hired to plant evidence in my apartment during the chaos of the police raid. Mrs. Wilkins was arrested and charged with filing a false police report, conspiracy, and theft. As for me, the police department issued a formal apology and offered to compensate me for the damage to my apartment and the stolen property. But I wasn't satisfied with just that. I decided to file a lawsuit against the police department for violating my civil rights. It was a long, arduous process, but in the end, it was worth it. Not only did I receive a substantial settlement, but the department was required to implement new training procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. As for Mrs. Wilkins, she ended up serving time in prison and was evicted from the apartment building. The last I heard, she had moved to another state. Looking back on the whole ordeal, I still can't believe how quickly my life was turned upside down. But I learned some valuable lessons. Never underestimate the pettiness of a disgruntled neighbor. Always stand up for your rights, and most importantly, be careful who you argue with about noise complaints. Now, whenever I hear about police raids or anonymous tips, I can't help but think about my own experience. It's a reminder that sometimes the system meant to protect us can be used against us, and that justice, while not always swift, can prevail if you're willing to fight for it. The next one is a petty revenge story. So, my first engineering degree was in mechatronics engineering. It was the last semester and we were in an industrial mechanisms class. The entire time I had gone to college, there were two guys that we will call CJ and Solomon because that was their real names. They were the most obnoxious and arrogant people you'd ever meet. They were loud, annoying, rude, profane, and just overall terrible people. To top it off, they didn't like me because I usually finished my tests first and got good remarks from my teachers. Well, CJ was kind of an idiot that rode the coattails of his friend Solomon pretty often. Neither were great, but Solomon tried harder than CJ usually. In this mechanisms class, everyone thought the tests were pretty tough. Lots of formulas, memorization, etc., on top of really long tests in general. In this class, I had been unfortunate enough for CJ to sit beside me all semester. I knew that he had been cheating off of my tests and lab work. I found out later he stole my lab papers and copied some programs I had written. On this test, I decided to let him suffer. On the test, I wrote down wrong answers everywhere. Everywhere. Answer is true? False. Answer is 76.8 lbft, 55.9 HP. I would leave enough right so it wasn't obvious, but I bombed that test. Then I started stretching and checking my answers. While doing this, I saw him frantically and casually copying my answers. When he was done, he turned his test in, and I went back and changed all of my answers. When the teacher gave us our tests back, he had bombed it. I still remember the look of shock on his face. He then looked over to my test and saw the grade on it. I then saw him checking his answers and my answers in utter confusion. Then there was a look of realization and he seemed pissed. He never copied my tests again. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I used to work as a supervisor in my last job and was directly working with a union. Some of my managers really didn't want to deal with things when it came to workplace injuries, so I had to deal with most of them. If you have worked with a union before, this is a very long and time-consuming process. While important, very tedious. So that brings us to that one evening. I was on my second double in a row of 3 and very much ready to go home. As I wrapped up my area, my evening manager texted me to assist another supervisor with an injury. The supervisor was newer and needed to be taught. I informed them I was already there on a double and needed to come back on the morning, and was there anyone else or could they help them? This manager, who was notorious for passing their work on others, he texted me no, and I had to stay until it was done. Okay, I have written documentation of a directive. Who am I to say no? Alright, well then, since I'm teaching, I'm going by the book. I opened up the union and company policy on workplace incidents and followed it step by step. By the time we got to the drug test portion, the local clinic we used was closed and we needed to call it in. This is important because if you don't use the local clinic, the out of area one takes 4+ hours to come out. While that was processing, I did a lengthy investigation with the union. I spent the entire night going by the book, taking pictures and documenting everything I could. By the time I finished and the drug test finished, it was 7 a.m. and my shift started in 30 minutes. This is the time the morning manager came in. They are one of my favorites and why I pick up mornings all the time. When she saw me, said, "Oh, you're in early." I said, "I never left." Her face dropped because they have a rule that while management, including supervisor, can work more than 16 hours if they work more than 20 hours, they need a 24-hour reset. I wasn't in the union, but still hourly salaried and got OT over 8 hours in a day. So not only was I going to not be able to make my morning shift, I couldn't make my evening shift either. I was still going to be paid for both while being sent home. She asked me who told me to do this, and I showed her the message from the evening manager telling me to stay until it is finished. I went home and enjoyed my extra day off into weekend. When I came back, I had an interview about the incident with the senior manager. After showing my messages, which the manager tried to delete but only did on his side, I was dismissed without any issues. The manager was written up by the senior manager and they had to pay me my 2 regular shifts plus 24 hours of overtime. Needless to say, I stopped picking up after that no matter how much they begged. The next one is an entitled people's story, so you all probably don't remember me. A while back, one of my high school bullies went on an incoherent drunken rant thinking I based a character in a book on her. I told people I would elaborate further one day, but never ended up doing so. I was going through a lot at the time. My mom was dying of a stroke. I was in a depressive state. I want to thank everyone who sent me condolences, BTW. I wasn't really in a state to do it back then. Then I spent the next 2 years getting my life together. Moved from my old city, got a new job, and recently an apartment. Been working on a web comic. I had honestly forgotten all about it for a bit and was pretty sure no one really cared for an update. Then I got an email. It was from a new address but had a familiar writing style. Yes, she decided to contact me again. And no, it was not to apologize and admit she was an ass, but to make fun of the fact my book was recently dropped from publication. Yes, unfortunately, the publishing company I was with dropped me, and you can no longer purchase my book. They told me it was from lack of interest, but I believe it was from the fact they did absolutely zero marketing for it. That's a whole can of worms in and of itself, but the long and short of it is I feel very scammed. But back to my apparent stalker. She seems to be under the impression she was behind getting my book dropped. In the email, she apparently sent the publisher an email saying I was a satirist. Your guess is as good as mine as to what she was trying to say. 2 years and she still can't spell for shit. But the reason I call her a stalker is because I only ever announced my book was dropped via Tumblr. Ergo, she's likely been stalking my social media pages for 2 years. This would be scary if not for the fact I sincerely doubt her ability to do any real damage. But let's wrap up this little novel. Hopefully it's more entertaining than my dropped book XD. Amber, I want to send you a message specifically, and I know you'll see it since I'm evidently all you ever think about morning, noon, and night. Just stop. Forget I ever existed like I forgot you existed. You'll likely be much happier for it. You should worry about more important things like your kids and getting sober. High school's over and you're never getting those years back no matter how much you cling to them. You're not the villain you think you are in my life, so stop making me the villain in yours. But yeah, that's all I've got to say about this, and hopefully we can all forget about this forever. If you've got any question though, feel free to ask. I'm in a much better state of mind than I was 2 years ago, so I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.